Vital Living presents Making Bouillon, or just making broth. The word bouillon comes from French cuisine and simply means broth. Sometimes the term broth is used for liquid flavored only with meat, while the term stock includes bones. But this really isn't a hard and fast rule. For Weston Price, we are always boiling bones. Bouillon cubes are a great shortcut when making soups and gravies, or when cooking grains. A couple cubes in the pot add flavor and make the whole process a little easier. Bouillon cubes also take up much less space than canned or frozen broth, and they last a long time. Of course, unless you're buying organic, store-bought bouillon cubes also contain MSG, hydrogenated oils, and plenty of salt. Of course, if you don't want to go through the whole process of making bouillon, you can just boil whatever bones you have handy in a small pot. The leftovers from tonight's chicken dinner, or whatever meat you happen to be eating this week, can just go right in that little pot. Add a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar to help leach out the minerals, and I sometimes add seaweed for additional minerals. Then simmer on low for a couple of hours. Pour off a cupful, add a little salt for flavor, and voila, your daily broth. Making your own bouillon cubes means you will have beneficial broth available whenever you need it. And as emergency foods go, it's a much healthier product. In addition, you can make use of bones that might otherwise get thrown out. Your bones may be pre-cooked or raw. Whenever I cowpool, cowpooling is buying part of a free-range cow, I make sure I get the bones. The butcher is happy to accommodate. Usually, I freeze them in bags for later boiling. I try to include at least one joint bone in each bag because the cartilage will provide a substantial amount of gelatin, which is what holds these cubes together. Or you can just save the bones from whatever cut of meat you're having for dinner and freeze them until you have enough to make a big batch of broth. When saving chicken carcasses, make sure you keep the neck, gizzard, and heart, but don't use that liver for broth. If you are lucky enough to be raising your own chickens, by all means include the feet. Just give them a good scrub first. If you're going to go to the trouble of making bouillon, make a large batch. You need a deep stock pot and enough bones to fill it halfway, and lots of non-fluoridated water. This allows the liquid to circulate freely around the bones. If your bones are raw, you can roast them in the oven first, which adds flavor, but this step is optional. Start by placing the bones in the pot and filling the pot with enough clean water to cover your bones. Your pot should be about half full. Add 1/4 of a cup of apple cider vinegar to help leach out the minerals, and let this set for 15 minutes or so. Then, add enough water to finish filling the pot and bring to a boil. At this point, if you're using raw bones, foam will rise to the top of the pot, and this must be skimmed off or the broth will taste less than ideal and be quite murky. This doesn't happen with cooked bones. Your stock will need to simmer for 12 to 24 hours to dissolve all of the cartilage off the bones. Bigger bones take longer. You will need to periodically add water so that the bones stay covered and the liquid is circulating. Once the cartilage is all dissolved, remove the bones and any meat and leave nothing but the broth. It's a good idea at this time to transfer your large batch of broth into a smaller pot. Just leave enough room for boiling and leave the lid off for evaporation, because now we boil and boil and boil until the liquid is reduced by about 3/4. Keep an eye on the pot and periodically put a lid on. This will wash gelatin off the sides. Be sure to remove the lid again so that evaporation can continue. Once you have reduced the broth, transfer it to a smaller pot for the final cook-down. As it continues to reduce, it will start to look sticky, and it will be. When the whole top of the pot is one big bubble, it's very close to done. Keep the temperature on low at this point because it's very easy to burn. I have thrown out entire batches because I screwed up at this point. Because of the gelatin, this bouillon is astoundingly sticky. There is a reason they make glue out of this stuff. If it cooks down too far, you'll have to add some water and start over because it just won't come out of the pot. When the big bubble stage is reached, I prepare a greased piece of aluminum foil with edges turned up to catch my bouillon. A nice square shape will make cutting easier later. Use a saturated fat for your grease. Liquid oils really don't do the job, and your aluminum foil will come off in pieces. I also put some of this grease on my spatula. Put the lid back on the pot one last time to melt the film on the top of the gelatin. 2 minutes is plenty. And then pour immediately onto your foil using the spatula to scrape the bottom. Don't get any on your skin. It's very hot. It can burn you. It should be just a little bit slow when it comes out of the pot and about the consistency of syrup. Once in the foil, allow it to harden. When cool, the texture should be like stiff rubber. If not, put it back in the pot and heat gently until it loses more water. It does take a bit of practice to judge this, and cook-down times vary depending on the amount of broth and the amount of gelatin. Alternatively, you can peel off the foil and put it in a food dehydrator. Just don't leave it too long or it will get too hard to cut. Cut the cubes 1/4 to 1/2 inch square and wrap them in small pieces of wax paper. You may be able to store them at room temperature depending on how much water is left in them, but try it out first by putting one in a jar and leaving it while the rest go in the freezer. The drier they are, the longer they last in a damp environment. But there's really no hard and fast rules here. I spend time in both Maine and Connecticut. In Connecticut, I have to keep my cubes in the freezer or they mold unless I've dried them out completely in the food dehydrator, which means they're about rock hard. In Maine, my slightly rubbery bouillon cubes will last up to a year or more in a pint jar on my shelf at room temperature with no problem. One batch of broth usually fills about a pint jar, and that lasts me 2 or 3 months the way I use it. This particular batch is a triple. I was really going for it that day. To reconstitute these bouillon cubes, they need to have heat. Unlike store bouillon cubes, they won't just break up in a bit of hot tap water. You'll have to boil them for a few minutes until they're dissolved. Generally, it's about 1 cube to 1 cup of water. But taste test, and remember there's no salt added to the initial cooking. I use these anytime a recipe calls for broth, or gravies, or sauces. I throw one in the pot when I'm cooking grains or rices. Remember, the bouillon process is not required if you're doing Weston Price, just the broth. But it's a good way to store bone broth without taking up a lot of space in your freezer.